Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes. I want to thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network. Now, if you appreciate content like this, please make sure that you like, follow, and subscribe posts and videos from both the Truth Be Told radio network website and my website, plus our social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Rumble, etc. So the Truth Be Told radio network website, of course, is www.truthbetoldnetwork.org, and my website is www.godsavetheking.org. So we really appreciate you listening to our shows. Really appreciate you checking out the Truth Be Told radio network. So what is God Save the King? Okay, now some of you have listened to me before. Hopefully, some of you are new listeners. What is God Save the King? Well, God Save the King is my ongoing 30-plus year biblical, historical, and scientific research project devoted to telling the Nativity the way it really would have happened. The traditional Nativity story is, in fact, Christian mythology and bears only the vaguest resemblance to, again, what really would have happened. Now, yes, there are a few bullet points that remain the same. Yes, Joseph and Mary definitely traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Yes, the shepherds found a baby in a manger wrapped in swaddling clothes. Yes, the young child, Jesus, and his parents were visited by these wise men from the east. And yes, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus fled to Egypt to avoid Herod's wrath. And yes, Herod murdered all the male children in and around Bethlehem. But Joseph and Mary's journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem was not overly hazardous, like sometimes the traditional versions say. It's also very likely they didn't travel alone. There's no donkey mentioned in the biblical record. There's no innkeeper mentioned in the biblical record. Although Jesus was laid in a manger, he definitely was not born in a stable or in a cave. Now, we explain that in other shows, won't go into detail here. But yes, he was laid in a manger, but where is a manger? In Judean architecture. It's not in a stable. It's in an ordinary Judean home, okay? And then although the young child Jesus, emphasis young child Jesus, was visited by the wise men, right? The Magi. There wasn't only three of them, and they weren't kings, and they didn't arrive the night of Jesus' birth, but over 1 year later. And yes, Herod murdered all the male children in and around Bethlehem, and that is horrific regardless of the number, but it probably wasn't more than 10 to 15 to maybe 20 children tops. It wasn't this massive thing that happened where he murdered hundreds or even thousands of children, as I have seen in some of the traditional versions of the Nativity story. So, God Save the King is based on four fundamental premises. Number one, Jesus was not born on December 25th. He just wasn't. I mean, the likelihood of Jesus being born on December 25th, the odds are exactly 1 in 365, just as if you picked any other date at random from the calendar. But there is no biblical evidence that points you at December 25th. And we'll talk about the historical the historical evidence regarding a December 25th birthday in other shows. It's already on some other shows, and I plan some other shows to talk about where did the December 25th tradition come from. It probably came from the arrival of the Magi. It's highly probable that the Magi arrived in December, and when the Magi arrived, that created a stir. The shepherds finding a baby in a manger, that did not create public notice that we're aware of. But when the Magi arrived, there was absolutely public awareness, and that most likely happened in late December of 2 BC. So therefore, there's your little quicko introduction to maybe where the idea came from, because then years later, when people were trying to figure it out, they said, well, there was this big uproar in Jerusalem, in late December of 2 BC. That had to have been when he was born, right? Now, that doesn't mean that's when he was born. That just means that's when the Magi arrived, right? So number one, Jesus was not born on December 25th. Number two, tradition is not evidence. Tradition is not evidence. And the traditional story does not stand up to biblical, historical, or scientific scrutiny. It just doesn't. It's just that simple. The traditional nativity story is Christian mythology. Number three, the traditional versions of the nativity story rarely include the historical context. And the historical context is what takes the real story, not the traditional story, but the real story, and gives it its weight, gives it its emphasis, and turns it into this epic tale. I mean, truly, truly epic. And I'm going to use a bizarre word here, mythological tale, but I don't mean mythological as in false. I mean mythological as in the quality of the story that is being told. It is epic. It is mythological. It is mythos. Okay. So we'll explain that in another one. But the traditional versions of the nativity story, they rarely include the historical background, and the historical background is what turns this into this amazing, amazing, amazing story. It is a political thriller. There is murder, there is war, there is intrigue, there is espionage, there is everything you would look for in a Tom Clancy novel on steroids. Okay, that is what the real nativity story looks like. And then finally, number four. So number one, not born on December 25th. Number two, tradition is not evidence. Number three, traditional versions don't include the historical context. And then number four, the nativity, get ready, I'm going to offend some people. The nativity is not a Christian story. It's not. It's a Jewish story. It is a Jewish story, and it must be returned to its Hebraic context in order for Christians to understand it properly. What we tend to do is we tend to look backwards through 2,000 years of this Christian tradition viewfinder, and then we engage in this really weird reverse engineering and place all of these concepts on the birth of Jesus, when it really just did not look like that. It really didn't look like that. And if you listen to any of my other shows, I'm adapting a quote here from Peter Jackson's treatment of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. In the very first movie, The Fellowship of the Ring, the Lady Galadriel is doing a voiceover and doing the introduction of the movie, and she says, "History became legend, legend became myth, and things that should not have been forgotten were lost." And that is exactly what has happened to the nativity story, is that the real story has been lost, and this mythology, and here I am using the word as a, what's the word I want to use here? As a pejorative, right? I'm using the word mythology as a pejorative this time, not the last time, this time, that the Christian mythology, the traditional nativity story, it didn't happen like that. It just did not happen like that. So the real story was lost. History became legend, legend became myth, and things that should not have been forgotten were lost. Okay, so now before we jump into our topic for today, let's take care of a little business. First, the views of the hosts and guests of God Save the King are not necessarily the views of the Truth Be Told Radio Network. And there are a variety of ways that you can listen to the Truth Be Told Radio Network. Number one, you can go to their website, www.truthbetoldnetwork.org, and click on the big listen button. You can, of course, listen on your Android app. You can listen on the MyTuner app, the Wi-Fi radio app, the TuneIn radio app, and you can listen on Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices. So you can just say, "Hey Alexa, hey Google, hey Siri, play Truth Be Told Radio Network." And then last but certainly not least, you can actually call in and listen to the show at 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977. And that's good for phones that have like unlimited long distance, but you don't want to eat up your data. right? So you can call in and use your phone that way. So last week, we what's the word I want to use here? We cracked the egg, right? We opened up the subject of what we're going to call the Star of Bethlehem. Now, in Scripture, in Matthew chapter 2, verse 2, we read that when the Magi arrived in Jerusalem and went straight to the court of Herod the Great, that they said, "We have seen his star." That's the phrase that is used in Scripture. His star. Okay. We have seen his star in the east, in the rising, and we have come to worship him. So there's going to be a lot of times when I am going to refer to this as his star, meaning the star, okay, or the celestial event that inspired the Magi to travel from their home in the Parthian Empire to Judea in search of the newborn King of the Jews. But the other label that we will use very frequently that has become both popular and convenient is to simply call it the Star of Bethlehem. And I have no great objection to that label. It's convenient because we also learned that when the Magi left Jerusalem and were headed due south to Bethlehem, we read that the star came and stood over where the young child was. In other words, it stood over Bethlehem, and therefore we call it, the Star of Bethlehem. So that's completely fair. There's nothing wrong with calling it the Star of Bethlehem. But just so you know, I will go back and forth between calling it his star and calling it the Star of Bethlehem. So like I said, last week we had my good friend Michael Parker on. And pardon me, didn't swallow right there. And Mike and I mean, we jumped straight to the punchline regarding identifying the Star of Bethlehem. Okay. I mean, we just went right there. But what we didn't do is we didn't really set it up. We didn't really give any background info. So what I want to do this week is I essentially kind of want to restart the conversation and lay the foundation for presenting the evidence that leads to the conclusion that what the Magi saw was an unprecedented series of celestial signs concerning the planet Jupiter and the star Regulus in the constellation of Leo, and that this began on January on July 29th of 3 BC and ran through October of 2 BC. So this was over a year-long series of events, again, involving the planet Jupiter, the star Regulus in the constellation of Leo. And this would have been a highly condensed series of signs that, number one, the condensed nature of it was unprecedented, but also the initial sign that kicked it off on July 29th of 3 BC. Also, that singular event would have been unprecedented in human history. Mathematically, it would have been possible for that sign to have occurred in the past, but I believe, based upon the historical context and the nature of what the Magi did, that this was the first time that sign ever would have been observed in human history. The first time it had ever been observed in human history, and then based upon their arcane knowledge, that they interpreted that sign, and then like I said, the highly condensed series of signs that followed it, and that they interpreted that to mean that there was a new king, a great king who had been born, and that he had in fact been born in Judea. But how do we get there? How do we get there? It's more than just understanding astronomy. Okay. It's way more than just understanding astronomy. So let's dial it back. Let's slow down and let's present let's lay the foundation. Let's lay the groundwork for presenting the evidence for what the Magi saw and how they reached the conclusion that they reached. Okay. So here we go. Let's jump into this, and like I said, let's lay the foundation and move forward. So what you could call this, if you want to give this episode a title, you could call this Introduction to Biblical Archaeoastronomy, Part 1. I don't know how many parts there are going to be. There might be several parts more, but I also might change the title as we move forward. So this is Introduction to Biblical Archaeoastronomy, Part 1. What did the Magi know that led them to the conclusion that what they observed in the heavens caused them to understand that a great king had been born and that this king had been born in Judea? Okay, so we're talking about the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2. Okay, now when we're talking about the birth of Christ in general, there's really only two sections of scripture that address it in any kind of detail. There's an odd reference here or there scattered throughout the Bible, but it's really primarily Luke chapters 1 and 2, and then a little bit of 3, and then Matthew chapters 1 and 2. That's pretty much it. I mean, that is basically it. And these are referred to as the Infancy Narratives. The Infancy Narratives, and they're what tell us about the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, up until now, we've been spending a lot of time, number one, correcting the date. Because as I said right at the beginning of the show, foundational premise number one is that Jesus was not born on December 25th. There is no biblical evidence that causes you to go searching for December 25th. If you start with a blank slate and then start with the biblical evidence and go where the evidence leads you, the evidence will not lead you to December 25th as a birth date. It just won't. The whole December 25th birth date thing came in later. It came in at least 100, and more realistically, like 200 years later is when that started getting talked about, right? And as I've already said in this episode and in others, I think it's the arrival of the Magi, okay, that triggered the notion that Jesus may have been born in December, but that is not where the evidence leads us. Okay, so once again, but today what we're doing is we're talking about the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, because this is a very significant subtext of the Nativity story. It's this very enigmatic record of these mysterious wise men from the east. And at first they visit Herod the Great in Jerusalem, and then they visit the young child, Jesus, in Bethlehem, and then they present these very expensive gifts to the family. And then they're warned by God in a dream not to go back to Herod. Then Joseph is warned in a dream that Herod is going to try to murder the young child. So Joseph takes Mary and Jesus to Egypt to get out of the way of Herod's wrath, and they wait until Herod died, and they get the word that he's died, and then they're able to safely return to Judea. But unfortunately, the unfortunate climax of this record is this horrific slaughter of the innocents, right? The murder of all of the male children in and around Bethlehem, 2 years old and younger. I mean, so it's this really intense story, okay? But there's a lot of mystery in the story, okay? I called it enigmatic a little bit ago, and that's a great word because this record provokes as many, if not more, questions than it provides answers. It's really just that simple. This record provokes as many, if not more, questions than it provides answers. And most of them focus around the highlight, now pun intended, they focus around the highlight of this quote unquote star. Okay. We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. They focus around this mysterious star identified by the wise men as the reason they traveled to Judea. Okay? They identify it as the reason they came. For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. Now, what the heck does that mean? What did they see? That's the big question. That is the singular biggest question. What did they see? Right? Okay. And then additionally, now, and I just want to mention it briefly now. We'll talk more about it either later today or in another episode. Not only do the Magi identify this as the reason they traveled from Parthia to Judea, but depending upon how you understand the record appears to say, okay, very important. The record appears to say that this star somehow led them directly to the young child Jesus. Now, we're going to talk all about that because that's very important that we don't misinterpret and misunderstand what the Bible is actually saying. But like I said, very mysterious, very enigmatic record, raises more questions than it provides answers, right? So if we were to make a list of these questions, I mean, we could probably make a list of a couple of dozen questions pretty easily, and we could spend days and weeks and months discussing these questions. Now, the irony, however, is that we don't really need a couple of dozen questions. We only really need a small handful of questions to keep us busy because there are a handful of core questions, maybe 4 to 8 questions total that are that are right at the center of this matter that frankly they have kept scholars and laymen extremely busy for about 2,000 years now trying to identify what the heck is this Star of Bethlehem? What is his star? What did the Magi see? And then the interconnected questions of, well, how do they even know what to look for? Why were they even looking? What? Okay, so those are a lot of the background questions that we want to answer, okay, that are going to help us understand how they reached the conclusion that what they saw should be connected to the birth of a great king, and not only the birth of a great king, but the birth of a king in Judea, right? In Judea. They traveled to Judea. Also, I'm going to throw this out there. It just popped into my head, so I'm just going to throw it out there. When the Magi arrived at the court of Herod the Great, they knew that Herod was a Roman appointee, and they openly, I mean openly, brazenly, openly, right in your face, they go right to Herod and they go, "Where is he who is born king of the Jews?" Where, in other words, where is the legitimate king? Because it's not you. And they showed no hesitation and no fear in marching right into his royal court and confronting him and saying, "Where is he who is born king of the Jews?" So, what is up with that? Now, that's the historical context. So, we're definitely going to get into that in other episodes, but that's the historical context that is behind this that really does. It turns this story into an epic. It is an international story of espionage and intrigue and murder and quote unquote Game of Thrones, right? This really is the original Game of Thrones because Herod was a tyrant. There's no question about that. He was a megalomaniac. There's no question about that. He was paranoid about his throne. His wives, plural, and children, plural, had greater claim to the throne than he did. So he was not beneath murdering them to protect his throne. So this is this amazing, amazing story. But let's get back to the star. What did the Magi see? What did they see? What did they see? So in 1979, there was a bibliographer who worked for the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Her name was Ruth Freitag. And in 1979, she published a bibliography of 240 books and articles concerning the Star of Bethlehem. Okay. Now that's 1979. I mean, come on, do the math. That's 50 years ago. That's 50 plus years ago. And at that time, 240 books and articles on the Star of Bethlehem, right? 10 years later, she republished the bibliography and added 110 additional items. Okay. 110 additional items. So in 1989, you're looking at 350 books and articles on the Star of Bethlehem. So now that's 30 years ago. So I mean, I have no idea what the number has reached today. The number of authors, the number of historians, the number of theologians who are trying to figure out what is the Star of Bethlehem. But most of these texts, okay, now most of these texts have been by astronomers. It's astronomers trying to match their understanding of astronomy with the Gospel of Matthew. Now, this is very interesting because there is only one mention in all of world literature to this famous star that marked the birth of the Jewish Messiah and thereby inspired these wise men from the east to travel to Judea and quote unquote worship him. Okay. Now, other elements of the story are familiar to us from other sources. Of course, we know about Israel in general. We know about Herod the Great. We even know about the Magi from secular historical records. But there is not even one additional mention in any contemporary literature of this famous star except the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament of the Judeo-Christian Bible. It's the only mention in all of world history. Now, I should probably make a quick comment about the earliest mention other than the Gospel of Matthew. The earliest mention other than the Gospel of Matthew comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James. Now, if you have listened to my show before, if you've gone to my website, you know that I make a big deal about the Proto-Evangelium of James. It is an apocryphal book. And in my opinion, it is an apocryphal book that cannot be trusted at all. It is legend. It is myth. Okay. Now, again, this time, using those words as pejorative, meaning there's nothing about these records that leads us to believe that they are historically accurate. Okay. And as a matter of fact, a few hundred years later, one of the popes, declared the Proto-Evangelium that no Christian, right, should read it. You should just forget about it, ignore it. And the reason, and it's not very long. I mean, when you type it out, it's only like 3 typed pages. It's like 25 to 30 paragraphs long. It's not really all that long. You can read the whole thing in 10 minutes, easy, right? It's not really all that long. But when you read this thing, one of the things you discover is that, if you critique the text, you find out very quickly that whoever wrote this was obviously, here you go, they were obviously familiar with the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. That they were familiar with. But what they were clearly not familiar with was direct contact with Jewish culture. Whoever wrote this wasn't a Jew. Okay. They were not a Jew. They did not live in the Bible lands. They don't get the geography right. They don't get the customs right, all this kind of stuff. So there are so many errors in facts that we can verify that when it comes to a fact that we can't verify, that's when it makes no sense to give them credibility. It really no credibility. And plus the fact that he was clearly familiar with the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, that means that this is not an independent source because he quote unquote mentions the star, right? He mentions the star, but if he's already read about it from Matthew, then this isn't and like I said, this is not an independent source. Pardon me, in any way, shape, or form, right? So this is in the Proto-Evangelium of James. In paragraph 21, we read, and the Magi said, we have seen a star, here you go, of great size shining among these stars and obscuring their light so that the stars did not appear. And we thus knew that a king has been born in Israel and we have come to worship him. And behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them until it came to the cave. there you go, and stood over the top of the cave. Okay. Jesus was not born in a cave. There is nothing in the Bible, nothing in the Bible that corroborates that. Okay. And I know you can go on a tour of Bethlehem in the Holy Lands, and the tour guides will say, this is where he was born, and they're going to show you a cave. Okay. That's not where he was born. Jesus was born in a traditional Judean home. That's what the Bible says. And there's no reason to think otherwise. Okay. And the proto-evangelium of James is just bunk. Okay. There's no reason to believe it. Now, the point here is that here you go, a star of great size. Okay. That doesn't make sense. That makes no sense, because when you read this in context, the Magi saw it and no one else did. Okay. So all of these spectacular theories become really questionable really quick, because somehow this was something that the Magi saw, but no one else saw. So if it had been a very spectacular, if this had been a very spectacular celestial event like a comet or a supernova, or this star of great size that was so bright that, according to the proto-evangelium of James, it obscured the light of the other stars, oh my God, you would have had a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people who swarmed Jerusalem and Bethlehem if it indeed led them, as the traditional version of the story would have you believe, if it moved independently through the night sky and led you to Bethlehem and then stood over the top of the cave. Oh my God, everybody and their brother would have been there. It wouldn't have been this three wise men on camels thing, which, that's a whole nother story. It wasn't three and they weren't kings, right? So kind of got a little bit off track there, but not really, because this is the earliest mention that I'm aware of the star, other than the Gospel of Matthew itself. But because whoever wrote this was familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, it's not an independent source. And you can quickly see this is 200 years. 200 years is way more than enough time for significant error to get into the picture. Okay. Now, like I said, I kind of got off track a little bit, but not really. That's important for us to understand regarding the fact that the Gospel of Matthew is the only record. It's it. It is the only record. There is no contemporary source that mentions it, right? So let's get back to all of these books, at least 350 books in the Library of Congress as of 30 years ago, trying to identify the Star of Bethlehem. So this is really a big deal. But most of these, here you go. See, most of these books are written by astronomers. Okay. In other words, they're written by scientists. And to just get right to the point and just to be blunt about it, most of these scientists, quote unquote, are avowed secularists and avowed skeptics who would like nothing better than to discredit the Bible. So it's very interesting, because a lot of them, here you go, a lot of these books have reached the conclusion that this star either never existed, that it is pure myth. There's that word again that I keep using, right? That it's pure fairy tale, right? That it simply never existed. So now let's fast forward and let's get up much, much, much closer to, modern history. In 2014, there was an international multidisciplinary academic colloquium dedicated to the subject of the Star of Bethlehem, held at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. I hope I'm saying that right. Groningen. Okay, it might be Groningen, depending if there's an umlaut or not. But anyway, Groningen in the Netherlands. So it's this international interdisciplinary academic colloquium, right? So this is the secular academic community, right? So at this colloquium, there were presented 22 peer-reviewed academic papers on subjects related to the star. Out of those 22 papers, only 4 of them affirmed that the star might have actually been a real object. Most of them reach the conclusion that this is just pure fiction, that this is just something that Matthew made up, that it's not a real star, or that, we're going to get into some other theories that it's an angel, or, things like that. Now, the academic papers don't reach that conclusion, but the point being is that these are skeptics. These are skeptics, and they've reached the conclusion that this is all giant fairy tale, right? Now, in an additional irony, on the flip side of the coin, there are the biblical scholars, okay? Many of whom are also not much help, right? Among the common theories regarding what the wise men saw, the least favored theory is that the Star of Bethlehem was a normal star in its normal course through the heavens, but it was identified by the wise men because of their expertise in celestial observation and arcane wisdom. Okay? Let me say that again. Let me slow down and say that again. The least favored theory among biblical scholars as well, okay, is that this was a normal star in its normal course, but that it was the expertise of the Magi in celestial observation and arcane wisdom that provided them with the skills and the tools necessary to identify this as the star, or as a star, that frankly announced the birth of the Hebrew Messiah. Okay? So, in the biblical research community, right, there are really only a handful of interested parties, and I count myself as one of them, who believe that this is indeed the best explanation of what happened. Okay? So, one more time. I know I'm repeating myself, but one more time. The Star of Bethlehem is best identified as a normal star, okay, in its normal course through the heavens, all right? Normal star on its normal course through the heavens, but it was the expertise of the wise men in celestial observation and arcane wisdom that allowed them to identify an unprecedented series of celestial events as pointing to the birth of the Messiah of Israel. That is, in my opinion, the best explanation. But ironically, okay, we're in a minority. We are in a minority. Most people don't believe that's the case, right? But if that is the best explanation, a normal star in its normal course, but it was the skill and expertise of the Magi, all right? The skill and expertise of the Magi that allowed them to identify this star, then what did they see? We're all the way around back to the same question. What was it that they saw? What did they see? Okay. And so, and where do we begin? Where do we even begin to research something like this? Where do we begin our investigation? Okay. Now, there are a variety of facts that will be very helpful for us to know up front, right? These, we can call them disclaimers, you can call them caveats and provisos. These are facts that are kind of important for us to know. They're very important for us to know, but they're extremely helpful if we know them right up front. If we know them right up front, they're really going to help our investigation. Okay. So, probably the first and most important caveat is to recognize that while our modern scientific understanding of astronomy will be very helpful in discovering the best explanation for what the Magi saw, modern astronomy and modern astrology will not solve the riddle by themselves. They just won't. Okay. So, this is one of the reasons, in my opinion, that a lot of these books written by these astronomers, there's one of them, I forget which one it is. I got several dozen of these myself. I don't have all 350 by any stretch, but I've got a lot of books on the subject. And it's very interesting how many of them have a subtitle that says an astronomer's approach, right? And so they look at it through the eyes of an astronomer, but they don't look at it through the eyes of a historian. They don't look at it through the eyes of a theologian. And you really have to do all of that to figure out what's going on here. It's really not just astronomy that leads us to this conclusion, right? So like I said, probably the first and most important disclaimer is the fact that although our modern understanding of astronomy will help us, okay, it'll be very helpful, extremely, extremely helpful. I mean, computer programs, computer software is what allows us, it's what allowed me to identify July 29th, 3 BC as this unprecedented event, okay? Right. Plus, plus the research of other men. I am not alone in this by any stretch of the imagination. Right. And I discovered it with a lot of help from other people. That was not me alone by by any stretch. Okay. But modern astronomy alone will not get you there. It just simply will not get you there. So if our proposition is true, that it was the expertise of the Magi, all right, in celestial observation, in arcane wisdom, that allowed them to recognize this unprecedented series of events involving the planet Jupiter and the star Regulus in the constellation of Leo, then how did they know what to look for? Okay. And I'm repeating myself, but I'm just really compelled to just emphasize this. It's very important that we do not try to take what we know about celestial observation and reverse engineer it backwards onto what the Magi knew and understood. What we need to do is we need to try to go after what did they know and understand. Like I said, not transpose what we know and understand backwards. Okay, like here's a perfect example. Let me take 1 second and try to get this up on my. Let me try to screen share here and get this up on the screen for you so that you can read along with me. Okay. Let's do this. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen. All right, there we go. So now read along with me here. See, so here's a good example. Ancient astronomers did not have a correct geophysical understanding of our solar system or the universe, right? They believed that the Earth was at the center of the universe and that all celestial motions centered on the Earth, centered upon the Earth. Now, despite this apparent disadvantage, ancient astronomers, through a combination of meticulously recorded observations made over centuries, plus skillful mathematical techniques, were able to determine the position of celestial bodies, both visible and non-visible, both in the past and in the future, with a high degree of accuracy. Okay, so this is very important. This is something we know about the ancient celestial observers. What did they know? How did they operate? What did they see? How did they think? This is extremely important. So on one hand, they didn't have a correct understanding of our solar system. They did not understand a heliocentric solar system. That was happening at the time. They were beginning to understand that around this time, but this was not, for lack of a better word, universal knowledge yet. It was not universally accepted that it was a heliocentric solar system. They thought it was an Earth-centric, right, solar system, right, and universe for that matter. But ironically, through very meticulous observation, because by the time of the birth of Christ, the Magi had been recording celestial events for 1,500 years. That's 1,500 years, meticulously recording astronomical positions. And they also had extremely good mathematics. Okay. There's lots of scientific articles out today that when we cross-reference them with the cuneiform tablets that have been recovered from the ancient Near East, we realize that they had really good math. Really, really good math. So they practiced a combination of both observation, but then mathematical prediction. Okay. So notice what I said in this here. They were able to predict, for lack of a better word, both in the future and in the past, both visible and non-visible celestial events, simply based upon the math and their pre-existing records of celestial observations. So in other words, meaning if they knew, well, if Jupiter's here and Venus is here, and we do the math and it's all in Aries and da 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 da, and they plug and play the math, they know that that same sign is going to occur again, or that it occurred in the past on such and such a date. Okay, so this is really important for us to understand what the Magi knew about astronomy, not what we know, right? What they know. Do not transpose backwards what we know and assume that they knew the same thing, because they didn't. Okay, so now, so getting back to the beginning here, I'm not off track. I'm not even remotely off track. It's just that I get excited about this material and presenting it to you guys. But if we're going to start at the beginning, let's start with a few more like disclaimers here that are important for us to understand. Because if you don't understand these simple facts, they can get in the way. They can make things more difficult to understand. They can lead to questions that don't get answered and confusion and stuff like that. So in the Bible, right, the English word star is usually a translation of the Greek word aster, A-S-T-E-R, or the Hebrew word kaukab, okay, and we spell that K-O-W-K-A-B, kaukab, right? So either Greek aster or Hebrew kaukab. The Greek aster, that's Strong's number 792. And when you're talking about the Hebrew kaukab, that's Strong's number 3556, if you're interested in that kind of thing. Okay. Now, like I said, in the Bible, the English word star is usually a translation of one of these two words. Very important to recognize, however, that the ancients did not necessarily understand the distinction between a star and a planet, for example. Okay. They understood it to a certain degree because of their observations. So, for example, if they go outside and they observe every day for not just a year, but every day for 10 years or 20 years or 100 years, then they've got a meticulous record, for example, of the star Sirius, right? Okay. The brightest star, quote unquote, in the heavens, right? So now they've got a detailed record of where Sirius is and where it will be on such and such a date. Okay. But if they compare the motion of Sirius with that bright light over there, they notice that that bright light over there moves very differently. It moves very, very differently. Okay. So if you're talking about what we now understand as a planet, okay, the planet Jupiter, for example, or Mulbabar in Babylonian, right? The planet Jupiter, by comparison to the stars are in effect stationary. They're not literally stationary, they just move extremely slow by comparison to the planets. The planets are the fast movers. And that is how ancient astrology worked, was that you were reading the signs of the planets against, which are the fast movers, against the backdrop of the stars, which are the stationary objects. Okay. So it's important to know that when you read the word star in the Bible, either the Greek word aster or the Hebrew word kaukab, it can mean an individual star, it can mean an individual planet, it can mean an entirely different celestial body, although they had, see, because here's the thing, both Hebrew and Greek had different words for like a comet, for example. They had different words. Nonetheless, the word aster could be used to describe a comet. And then, most importantly, in both Hebrew and in Greek, these words are used to refer to an entire constellation or asterism, right? So, like, for example, two of the texts that we are going to look at in detail, not today, but over time, two of the texts that we are going to look at in detail are Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, and then Genesis chapter 37, verse 9, because you have two very, very similar references here, okay, in certain ways. Now, Genesis 37, 9, this is Joseph's dream, one of Joseph's dreams, where he says, I have dreamed yet another dream. And he told it to his brothers and said, behold, I have dreamed a dream more. The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars, and by that he means the 11 constellations, made obeisance to me. Okay. So it doesn't mean an individual star, it means a constellation. Then, if we look at Revelation 12:1, we read, there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Okay. Now, at one time, many of us believe that that was a reference to the ecliptic. Okay. That the 12 stars meant the 12 constellations, right? I now have changed my mind, and I believe it literally means 12 stars, not the 12 constellations, right? But these are just two examples of, you got one where it's referring to individual stars, but another where it's referring to entire constellations. And it's really easy to get that confused, right? And just wanted to point that out to you guys, that this is very important as we move into our understanding of what it was the Magi saw. Okay. And now we're starting to run out of time here. So I want to give you a couple of more points as we kind of wrap up here to once again, to lay the foundation of what it was that the Babylonian Magi saw, the Parthian Magi. What was it that they saw, and what was it, according to their understanding, that allowed them to reach the conclusion that they reached? Okay, so I mentioned something a minute ago. I want to give you a little bit of additional information about that. That the earliest known record we have, in other words, the earliest, what's the word I want to use? Rats. Manuscript evidence, and it's not manuscript, it's clay tablet. Okay. Documentary evidence. That's the word I wanted. The earliest documentary evidence we have of what the Babylonian astrologers knew and understood was that we have a clay tablet. I've got a graphic. I just don't have it handy. I'll show it to you next week. I have a graphic. It's called the Venus Tablet of a Misaduca. And the Venus Tablet of a Misaduca is a catalog tracking the heliacal risings of the planet Venus. And it was written during the reign of King Misaduca of Babylon, probably between 1646 and 1626 BC. Okay, so that is 1600 years before Christ. They were already engaging in meticulous records of the stars. Okay, very, very important. I actually saw online last night. I was doing my show prep for today, and I literally tripped over a new image that I hadn't seen before. I'll have to research it before I share it with you guys, because I want to do my due diligence and make sure it's at least reasonably accurate. But I tripped over a picture of a clay tablet which is funny because it's only the size of a man's hand. It's only, maybe 4 to 5 inches in diameter. Maybe 6 at the most, 5 to 6 inches in diameter, about the size of a man's hand. There's a man holding this clay tablet, and it's got these tiny, tiny, tiny cuneiform markings on it. And they claim that this is a 5,500-year-old. Now, that's 5,500 years from now. Okay. So that would make it, 3,500 BC, not 1,500 BC. But they're claiming this is a 3,500, 3,500 years before Christ cuneiform tablet. of an astronomical diagram. See that the caption underneath said that it was a astronomical diagram of Nineveh. Well, now Nineveh is a city on the earth. Okay, so I'm assuming they meant that either the tablet was found in Nineveh, right? Or it's a tablet recording observations from Nineveh, but it's not. I'm assuming they don't mean it's an astronomical chart of Nineveh. That doesn't really seem to make sense. But I want to wrap up here. Very, very important that we understand that these guys really kept amazing records, and they kept amazing records for a long time. So one of the things we want to do here, this is the point I wanted to make to wrap up, is that whenever possible, I want to try to quote experts on the subject, and I want to try to actually quote ancient sources whenever possible, because like I said, very important that we try to understand what they knew and understood about what we are going to call archaeoastronomy. Archaeoastronomy is what ancient cultures knew and understood about astronomy, astrology, and astromancy. And we'll talk more about what those three words mean in a future episode. But like I said, very important that we understand what they knew and understood, not what we know, and transposing it backwards. What did they know about astronomy, astrology, and astromancy? And frankly, the fact that they didn't make a distinction. We're going to talk about those three things as if they're distinct. They didn't make a distinction between those three different sciences or arts. So we're going to wrap up there. Once again, my name is Tim Keyes. This is God Save the King. You can hear God Save the King every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Truth Be Told radio network. Once again, if you appreciate this kind of content, please make sure that you like, follow, and subscribe to the posts and the videos from both my website and the Truth Be Told radio network website. That's www.godsavtheking.org and www.truthbetoldnetwork.org. That's all for now. We will see you next week. God save the King.